Vulnerable populations during the conservative counterevolution. Women and children. Many people considered women's femininity to have been somewhat lost during the women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 1970s. In the 1980s, conservatives, and especially the New Right, were fierce opposers for the progression of women's rights and often advocated for legislation which would essentially lead to their regression. In 1990, women's groups fought for and won more funding for child care programs on the state level. During the 1980s, give or take a couple of years before and after, many children were living in poverty, more babies were being born with drug addictions, funding for public schools was inadequate, and young people were often victims of violent crime. Immigrants. There was a large influx of immigrants to the United States after the enactment of the Immigration Act of 1965, and with this, the number of undocumented immigrants also continued to rise. Undocumented immigrants often worked in harsh, unsafe conditions. Gays and lesbians. The AIDS epidemic of the 1980s was all but ignored by the Reagan administration, and gays and lesbians were discriminated against heavily because of other Americans' fear of this mysterious disease. They sought legislation for protection of their rights and to make it illegal to discriminate based on sexual orientation. Aging Americans. Between 1959 and 1989, rates of poverty in aging Americans dropped drastically due to Medicare, the Older Americans Act of 1965, SSI, and Social Security. Some important issues still remain for this population, however, as many services weren't covered by Medicare, and Medicare was also associated with high fees. Rates of Alzheimer's was increasing, and the allotment of social spending for the elderly was losing momentum. Poor and homeless. Tax rates of poor and homeless persons were increasing. Workers' paychecks were decreasing. Increasing numbers of Americans and their families couldn't afford housing, and social services and other welfare benefits were significantly being cut. The Reagan and Bush administration were hardly effective at combating any of these issues.